It is one of the most unsettling scenes in the Hebrew Bible. The camp of Israel is weeping at the entrance to the tent of meeting. A deadly plague is tearing through the community. People are dying by the thousands. And right in the middle of this national mourning, in full view of Moses and the weeping congregation, an Israelite man named Zimri walks past the holy sanctuary. He is bringing a Midianite woman into his family tent. It is a scene of breathtaking defiance. And then, a man stands up. His name is Phinehas. He is a priest, the grandson of Aaron. By definition, a priest is a man of mediation, a man of the altar, a man meant to represent life, intercession, and holiness. But Phinehas does not offer a sacrifice. He does not begin to pray. Instead, Numbers chapter 25 tells us that he takes a spear in his hand. He leaves the assembly, follows the man into the tent, and with one thrust, drives the weapon through both the Israelite man and the Midianite woman. For a modern reader, this is incredibly difficult to read. It feels like vigilante justice. It looks like a terrifying explosion of uncontrollable human rage. If we witness this today, we would call it an atrocity. We would label it religious extremism. Our instinct is to turn the page, to write it off as primitive ancient history, or to bury it under our preference for stories about grace and healing. But the biblical text refuses to let us look away. It does something entirely unexpected. God does not condemn Phinehas. God does not strike him down for taking a life. Instead, the moment the spear is thrown, the terrible plague that was destroying the camp instantly stops. And then God speaks. He tells Moses that Phinehas has turned away divine wrath, and God gives this priest a reward that sounds like a complete contradiction. Because of this violent act, God says he is granting Phinehas a covenant of peace. A covenant of peace, given to a man holding a bloody weapon. That sounds impossible. It feels like a jarring paradox that Scripture is forcing us to confront. How can an act of fatal violence result in a divine promise of shalom? This is the tension at the heart of the story. Most people read Numbers chapter 25 and stop at the shock of the spear. But in doing so, they miss one of the most profound theological patterns in all of Scripture. Because the Bible does not remember Phinehas as a violent fanatic, he is remembered as a hero. His action is celebrated hundreds of years later in the Psalms. He introduces a pattern of holy devotion that will be picked up by the greatest of the prophets, and ultimately, the pattern that begins right here, in this blood-stained tent, is the exact same pattern that Jesus will step into centuries later. But to see how that is possible, we have to strip away our modern assumptions. We have to realize that Phinehas was not acting out of a sudden loss of temper. He was operating within a very specific, deeply biblical framework. He was driven by an emotion that English translations struggle to capture, and that we deeply misunderstand. Most people stop at the violence and miss the deeper context. They miss what was actually happening in the camp, because this was not just a moral failure. It was an invisible infection that was about to destroy the entire nation, right on the edge of the promised land. To understand why the spear of Phinehas brings peace, we first have to understand the geography of the crisis. At this point in the biblical story, the Israelites are camped on the plains of Moab. They are at a place called Shittim. The 40 years of wilderness wandering are finally over. They are standing right on the edge of the promised land. The Jordan River is just ahead of them. The long wait is finished. But while the people are resting in the valley, a hidden war has been taking place on the cliffs above them. The king of Moab had hired a sorcerer named Balaam to stand on the high places and curse the nation of Israel. But God intervened. He shielded his people. Every time Balaam opened his mouth to pronounce a curse, God turned it into a blessing. Israel was perfectly protected from external attacks. They could not be destroyed by foreign magic or foreign armies. But since they could not be cursed from the outside, a new, far more dangerous strategy was formed. They would have to be corrupted from the inside. If Israel could be seduced into breaking their covenant with God, their own rebellion would destroy them. God's protective presence would have to withdraw, and the strategy worked. Numbers chapter 25 tells us that the men of Israel began to indulge in sexual immorality with the women of Moab and Midian. But this was not merely a failure of physical discipline. It was something far more severe. The text tells us that these women invited the Israelites to the sacrifices of their gods. The people ate the sacrificial meals and bowed down before foreign altars. And then, Scripture uses a terrifying phrase. It says, "So Israel yoked themselves to the Baal-Peor." Yoked. It is an agricultural word. It is the image of two animals strapped together by a heavy wooden beam, forced to move in the exact same direction. But it is also deeply covenantal language. Israel was supposed to be bound only to Yahweh. They were the bride of God, rescued from slavery, brought through the desert, and sustained by grace. Now, on the very threshold of their inheritance, they are willingly tying themselves to the dead idols of the surrounding culture. This was not just a mistake. It was spiritual treason. It was a complete collapse of the covenant that kept them alive. And the result is catastrophic. Because the covenant is broken, a deadly plague breaks out in the camp. It moves with terrifying speed. By the time the narrative ends, 24,000 Israelites will be dead. This is the context we usually miss. The nation is dying. A spiritual cancer has entered the body, and it is spreading toward the heart of the community. The leadership is paralyzed. Moses and the elders are weeping at the entrance to the sanctuary, watching their people be consumed by the consequences of their own idolatry. And right in the middle of this national funeral, an Israelite leader named Zimri walks by. He is not hiding. He is not ashamed. He publicly parades a Midianite woman through the weeping crowd and takes her into his family tent. It is a dagger aimed directly at the heart of the camp. If this blatant rebellion is allowed to stand, the infection will become complete. There will be no nation. There will be no promised land. The bride of God will die in the wilderness. This is the exact moment Phinehas stands up. When he grabs the spear, he is not losing his temper. He is not acting out of malice or personal hatred. He is driven by a very specific, fiercely protective biblical emotion, an emotion that English translations usually call zeal or jealousy. But it is a concept that our modern vocabulary has completely flattened, and one that we desperately need to understand. The word used to describe what drove Phinehas is the Hebrew word qin'ah. In our English Bibles, it is usually translated as zeal or jealousy, and immediately we run into a problem. In English, jealousy is almost always a negative emotion. It is petty. It is rooted in insecurity, fear, envy, and a desire for control. When we call someone jealous, we are usually describing a deep flaw in their character. So when we read that a man took up a weapon and ended 2 lives out of jealousy, our modern minds naturally go to the darkest, most unstable human motivations. But the Hebrew word qin'ah carries a very different weight. The root of the word carries the visual idea of becoming deeply flush, of turning red in the face. It describes a sudden, intense surge of profound emotion. In the biblical worldview, qin'ah is not a petty flaw. When it is used in the context of God's covenant, it is the fierce, uncompromising, protective love of a husband defending his bride. Think about the nature of a marriage vow. If a husband sees someone actively trying to destroy his wife, or trying to lure her into something that will ruin her life, he does not stand by passively. If he simply shrugs his shoulders and says it does not matter, we would not say he is incredibly tolerant. We would say he does not actually love her. True, covenantal love has boundaries. And when those boundaries are violently breached, love responds with a fierce, protective passion. That is biblical qin'ah. It is the fire that guards the house. It is the immune system that attacks a lethal infection in order to keep the body alive. In Numbers chapter 25, verse 11, God breaks his silence after the spear is thrown. And what he says completely rewrites our understanding of the event. God says to Moses, "Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron the priest, has turned back my wrath from the Israelites, for he was zealous with my zeal among them." He was zealous with my zeal. Notice what just happened. Phinehas was not acting out of his own human rage. He was not throwing a violent tantrum. He was a priest. By definition, His entire life was supposed to be a reflection of God's character. A priest's job was to stand in the gap between heaven and earth. And in this terrible moment, standing in a weeping camp surrounded by thousands of dead bodies, Phinehas felt the very heartbeat of God. God was grieving. His bride, whom he had rescued from slavery and carried through the desert, was willingly walking into a spiritual death trap. The nation was being consumed by a plague of their own making. Phinehas felt the protective jealousy of the Creator watching his people be destroyed, and he stepped in to stop it. Sometimes, a priest stands in the gap by offering a sacrifice on an altar, but sometimes, standing in the gap means stopping the infection before it kills the patient. The spear was not an act of blind fury. It was an act of radical preservation. Zimri was openly plunging a dagger into the heart of the community. Phinehas acted with God's own protective passion. He shared the divine grief over sin and the divine urgency to save the nation from complete erasure. This is where the pattern begins to become clear. This was not a man losing his mind. This was a priest protecting a bride. And because Phinehas mirrored the heart of God in the darkest hour of the wilderness wanderings, God responds. He speaks a blessing over this blood-stained priest. But it is a blessing that completely shatters our categories. Because of his protective zeal, God gives Phinehas a reward. And that reward forces us to rethink everything we assume about the nature of biblical peace. In Numbers chapter 25, verse 12, God speaks over the aftermath of the plague. He tells Moses, "Therefore say, Behold, I give to him my covenant of peace." A covenant of peace. In Hebrew, it is called a Brit Shalom. And for most modern readers, this is the hardest verse in the entire chapter to understand. How can a man holding a blood-stained weapon be given a covenant of peace? To our minds, violence and peace are absolute opposites. You cannot have one if you have the other. But this tension exists because we often misunderstand the biblical concept of peace. When we hear the English word peace, we usually think of a lack of conflict. We think of stillness, a quiet environment. We imagine enemies putting down their weapons and agreeing to stop fighting. But the Hebrew word shalom is far more robust than just the absence of noise or the end of a battle. The word begins with the idea of wholeness. It means completeness. It is the idea of a complex system where every single part is functioning exactly as it was designed to function. It means health. It means restoration. It describes a state where nothing is missing and nothing is broken. When we understand shalom as wholeness, the action of Phinehas suddenly comes into sharp focus. Think of the nation of Israel as a single, living body. This body had been infected with a lethal, spiritual cancer. The idolatry at Baal-Peor was not just a bad habit. It was a plague that was destroying the organism from the inside out. 24,000 people were already dead. The infection was spreading rapidly. If you have a deadly disease moving toward your heart, leaving it alone does not bring peace. Tolerating it does not bring wholeness. It brings death. The only way to restore shalom to a dying body is to forcefully, decisively remove the infection. You have to send a surgeon in to cut it out. That is the safest way to read what Phinehas was doing. He was not creating chaos. He was stopping the chaos of the plague. He was acting as a surgeon for the nation. By removing the fatal infection of Zimri's brazen rebellion, Phinehas stopped the disease from spreading to the rest of the camp. He did not just end a life, he preserved the life of the entire community. He brought the body back to a state of wholeness. And because he defended the life of the nation, God responds with the Brit Shalom. He promises that the line of Phinehas will have a lasting priesthood. Because Phinehas fiercely protected the covenant, his family will be entrusted to serve at the altar for generations to come. This shifts everything about how we read the story. It was not a random explosion of anger. It was an act of severe, saving intervention. But the pattern does not stop in the book of Numbers. Pause for a second and see what has emerged. So far, this has not been a random set of details. The zeal of God appeared first in the wilderness, then moved into the hands of a priest, and now the truth of what happened is becoming harder to miss. To really understand the theological weight of that day, we have to fast forward hundreds of years. Long after the wilderness wanderings were over, the biblical writers looked back at this exact moment. In the book of Psalms, a writer reflects on the failure at Baal-Peor and the intervention of the man with the spear. And the words used to describe Phinehas in that psalm are absolutely stunning. The biblical text summarizes his action with a specific phrase, a phrase that forces us to see his protective zeal as the ultimate act of saving faith. Because hundreds of years later, the scriptures look at this priest and give him a title that, up until that point, had only been given to one other man in the entire history of Israel. In Psalm 106, the writer looks back at the darkest moments of the wilderness wanderings. The psalm recounts the rebellion at the edge of the promised land. It describes how the people yoked themselves to the idols of Peor and provoked the Lord to anger. It remembers how the plague broke out and began to consume the camp. And then it describes the intervention. The text says, Phinehas stood up and intervened, and the plague was checked. But it is the very next line that changes how we must view this story. In verse 31, the Psalms make a theological declaration about Phinehas that echoes all the way back to the beginning of the biblical narrative. The text says, "And that was counted to him as righteousness, from generation to generation, forever." Credited to him as righteousness. If you know the language of the Bible, that phrase should immediately catch your attention. In the entire Hebrew text, this specific concept of an action or belief being credited as righteousness is rooted in only one other major foundational moment. It takes us back to the patriarch Abraham. In Genesis chapter 15, God takes Abraham outside, points to the night sky, and promises him that his descendants will outnumber the stars. Abraham is old, his wife is barren. The promise seems physically impossible, but Genesis tells us Abraham believed the Lord, and he counted it to him as righteousness. For thousands of years, Abraham has been held up as the ultimate biblical model of faith. He simply believed the promise of God, and he was declared righteous. But here, in Psalm 106, the exact same theological weight is applied to Phinehas. This creates an incredibly profound tension. On one hand, you have Abraham, looking up at the stars in the quiet of the night, silently trusting the word of God. On the other hand, you have Phinehas, standing in a camp filled with dead bodies, driving a spear through two people to stop a plague. How can both of these moments be credited as righteousness? To our modern minds, faith is usually defined as an internal, intellectual belief. It is something that happens in the quiet of our own hearts. But in the biblical worldview, faith is not passive. Righteousness is not just a legal status or a private feeling. Righteousness is covenant loyalty. It is a fierce, uncompromising allegiance to the promises and the holiness of God. Abraham showed covenant loyalty by trusting that God could bring life out of a barren womb. Phinehas showed covenant loyalty by trusting that God's holy standard was the only thing that could keep the nation alive. Phinehas saw that the covenant was being violently broken. He saw that the bride of God was tying herself to an idol that would destroy her. And in that terrifying moment, he aligned his heart so completely with the heart of God that he took action to protect the community. His spear was not a rejection of faith. In that specific, horrific context, it was the ultimate expression of it. He stood in the gap. He acted righteously because he acted as a faithful priest, guarding the sacred boundary between life and death. This is the deeper pattern that begins to emerge. The Bible is establishing a theological framework. It is showing us the archetype of the zealous priest. The Bible is establishing a theological framework. It is showing us the archetype of the zealous priest, the man who shares the protective jealousy of God, the man who is willing to intervene when the covenant is collapsing in order to save the people from their own destruction. This pattern of the zealous priest is now set. But it does not stay in the wilderness. It does not end with Phinehas. Because centuries later, the nation of Israel will fall into an apostasy even darker than Baal-Peor. The covenant will be broken again. The people will turn to foreign altars again, And right when the nation is on the edge of total spiritual collapse, a prophet will step out of the desert to claim the exact same mantle. Hundreds of years after the Israelites cross the Jordan River, the nation fractures. The northern kingdom descends into a spiritual darkness that looks terrifyingly familiar. The king is a man named Ahab. His queen is Jezebel. And together, they do not just tolerate idolatry, they institutionalize it. They systemically hunt down the prophets of Yahweh and replace them with the prophets of Baal. It is Baal-Peor all over again. But this time, the threat is not coming from a foreign camp. It is being orchestrated from the very throne of Israel. The covenant is flatlining. The spiritual cancer has reached the brain of the nation, and right when the body is about to die, a man steps out of the wilderness to intervene. His name is Elijah. We usually remember Elijah for the sheer spectacle of his ministry. We picture him standing on Mount Carmel, calling down fire from heaven to consume a water-soaked altar. We remember the dramatic defeat of the 450 prophets of Baal. But if we only see Carmel as a display of power, we miss the theological architecture underneath it. Elijah is not just calling down fire. He is performing an act of radical covenant preservation. Just like Phinehas, Elijah sees the bride of God tying herself to a dead idol. Just like Phinehas, he steps into the gap. And just like Phinehas, his intervention involves a severe removal of the infection. The prophets of Baal are executed at the Kishon River. The cancer is cut out so the body can survive. But the biblical text makes the connection between these two men explicit. After the showdown at Carmel, Queen Jezebel puts a bounty on Elijah's head. The prophet runs for his life. He flees deep into the southern desert, traveling 40 days and 40 nights until he reaches Horeb, the mountain of God. He hides in a cave, and there, God speaks to him. In 1 Kings, chapter 19, verse 9, the word of the Lord comes to him and asks a simple question. "What are you doing here, Elijah?" Listen carefully to exactly how the prophet answers. In verse 10, Elijah replies, "I have been very zealous for the Lord God of hosts." I have been very zealous. In Hebrew, he uses the exact same root word that God used to describe Phinehas in the book of Numbers. He says, "I have been filled with qin'ah." This is not a coincidence. Elijah is deliberately claiming the mantle of the ancient priest. He is telling God, "I saw the covenant breaking. I saw the nation dying, and I acted with your fierce, protective jealousy. I was the immune system for the camp." Elijah understands his own ministry through the lens of Phinehas. He recognizes that he has stepped into the exact same archetype. The pattern is now unmistakable. First, there is a catastrophic rebellion that threatens to destroy the people of God. Second, the leadership is paralyzed or complicit. Third, a zealous mediator steps forward, sharing the protective heartbeat of God. And fourth, the mediator takes drastic action to remove the infection and save the remnant. This is the architecture of divine devotion. This is what it looks like to guard the shalom of the community in the Old Testament. But as profound as this pattern is, it is only a shadow. The interventions of Phinehas and Elijah were real, but they were temporary. They stopped the plague for a moment, but they could not cure the underlying disease of the human heart. The people would eventually rebel again. The idols would eventually return. The story requires a final intervention. It requires a final, zealous priest. And centuries later, in the 1st century, that priest finally arrives. He walks into the temple in Jerusalem, and he is burning with the exact same protective jealousy, but when he steps into the pattern, he does something that no one could have ever seen coming. He takes the ancient archetype of the zealous priest, and he completely flips it upside down. When Jesus walks into the temple in Jerusalem, the air is thick with the exact same spiritual tension that hovered over the plains of Moab. It is the season of Passover. The temple is supposed to be the beating heart of the covenant. It is the place where heaven and earth intersect, where the shalom of the nation is maintained through sacrifice and prayer. But when Jesus arrives, he does not find a sanctuary. He finds a marketplace. The religious leaders have allowed the sacred space to be corrupted from the inside. The court of the Gentiles is filled with livestock and money changers. The worship of Yahweh has been tangled up with exploitation and greed. The bride of God is compromised once again, and Jesus does not respond with passive tolerance. In John chapter 2, the text tells us that he makes a whip out of cords. He drives the sheep and cattle out of the courts. He scatters the coins of the money changers and overturns their tables. He clears the infection out of the holy space. To the casual observer, this looks like a sudden, violent loss of temper. It looks like a man losing control. But the disciples standing in the courtyard see exactly what is happening. They recognize the ancient pattern. John chapter 2, verse 17 says, "His disciples remembered that it is written, 'Zeal for your house will consume me.'" Zeal. It is the exact same concept. Jesus is feeling the precise, protective jealousy of a husband defending his bride. He is acting as the ultimate zealous priest. He is looking at a spiritual cancer that is threatening the life of the community, and he is fiercely stepping in to cut it out. But this is where the biblical pattern reaches its absolute climax, and it is where the ancient shadow gives way to a breathtaking reality. Because Jesus takes the pattern of the zealous priest and he completely flips it upside down. Think back to the wilderness. Think back to Mount Carmel. Up until this moment, the zealous priest guarded the covenant by turning the weapon on the people who were breaking it. Phinehas threw the spear into Zimri to stop the plague. Elijah executed the prophets of Baal to cut out the idolatry. The infection was removed by destroying the infected. And it worked. It preserved the nation. It brought a temporary covenant of peace. But Jesus knows that the deepest plague is not just in a few rebellious individuals. The ultimate disease is human sin, and it has infected the entire camp. Every single person is compromised. If Jesus fulfills the pattern exactly the way Phinehas did, no one survives. If he turns the weapon on the ones breaking the covenant, the entire camp is destroyed. So the ultimate zealous priest does something unthinkable. He still intervenes. He still stands in the gap to stop the plague. He still brings a covenant of peace. But he does not drive the spear into the sinners. He takes the spear himself. In John chapter 19, verse 34, Jesus is hanging on the Roman execution rack. The ultimate plague of sin and death is destroying the world. The true priest is offering the final sacrifice. And the text explicitly tells us that a Roman soldier steps forward, takes a spear, and pierces his side. The weapon that was meant for the camp is absorbed by the priest. Phinehas held the spear to stop the plague. Jesus took the spear to stop the plague. Phinehas brought a temporary peace by taking blood. Jesus established an eternal covenant of peace by giving his own. He stood in the gap and absorbed the judgment so the bride could live. The shadow was real, but the substance changes everything. And when you see how Jesus completely transforms this ancient pattern, it forces a deeply uncomfortable question. Because if the ultimate zealous priest laid down his life to save the camp, it completely changes what biblical zeal is actually supposed to look like for us today. If Jesus is the true and better Phinehas, it changes exactly how we are supposed to live out biblical zeal today. For a lot of modern readers, religious zeal is almost always associated with anger. We think of outrage. We think of loudly condemning the culture, attacking those who compromise, and fighting a spiritual war by cutting down our enemies. When we see the covenant being broken, our instinct is to reach for the ancient spear. We want to call down the fire of Elijah. But Jesus refuses to let us stay in the shadow of the old pattern. He honors the zeal of the ancient priest. The protective jealousy of God was absolutely necessary to keep the nation alive in the wilderness. The surgeon had to aggressively cut out the cancer, or the body would have died before it ever reached the promised land. But on the cross, Jesus revealed the ultimate architecture of divine devotion. He showed us that in the new covenant, true biblical zeal is not about destroying the infected. True zeal is about absorbing the cost to heal the infection. To be zealous for the house of God today does not mean being the angriest person in the room. It does not mean treating broken, compromised people as targets that need to be struck down. True qin'ah, that fierce, protective jealousy of God, looks like a willingness to stand in the gap. It means possessing an uncompromising love for the holiness of God, while also possessing a radically self-sacrificial love for his people. It means telling the truth when a spiritual cancer is threatening the community. We cannot tolerate the idolatry of Baal-Peor. We cannot passively watch the bride of Christ yoke herself to the dead idols of our modern world. True love does not ignore a fatal disease. But when we intervene, we do not intervene with the weapons of the world. We intervene with a love that is willing to bleed for the restoration of the body. Because that is what brings the Brit Shalom, the covenant of peace. True wholeness does not come through our human outrage. It comes through the great high priest who stepped into the weeping camp, looked at the deadly plague of our own rebellion, and laid down his life to stop the spread. When you read Numbers chapter 25, it is completely understandable to be shocked by the violence. It is a harsh, severe moment in the history of Israel, but it was never meant to be the final word on divine justice. It was the beginning of a theological thread. It established the archetype of the mediator who shares the protective heartbeat of God. Phinehas was a faithful priest for his time. He guarded the sanctuary. He protected the bride. And his severe intervention was credited to him as righteousness, because he saved the nation from complete erasure. But he was only a shadow. The substance is Jesus of Nazareth. He is the priest who does not just protect one ancient camp in the desert, but offers a covenant of peace to the entire world. He is the mediator who does not shed the blood of the guilty, but offers his own blood to make the guilty clean. The story of the man with the spear was never just an isolated tale of ancient violence. It was the quiet architecture of redemption. It was the first faint sketch of a love so fierce, so protective, and so uncompromising that it would eventually take a spear to the heart just to save its bride.